Hi class, in this recording we're going to continue our discussion of biomolecules within human anatomy and physiology. So let's talk about carbohydrates. As we think of a carbohydrate, they are a hydrophilic molecule, meaning that they like to be dissolved in water. They have a tendency to be dissolved in water. As we think of the function of a carbohydrate, they're primarily going to be used as a source of energy in our body. Eventually, all digested carbs will make their way to glucose or something very similar to glucose, and from there we oxidize them to make adenosine triphosphate, ATP, the energy currency of our cells. Now, as we look at carbohydrate, there are some root words associated with carbohydrates, such as saccharide. So if you see this in the beginning, or if you see this word, this root within a word, that refers to carbohydrates. If the suffix at the end of the word is ose, os, think of glucose, fructose, lactose. That's another way to denote that we're talking about a sugar. As we look at our carbohydrates, they can be monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides typically. Very important monosaccharides include glucose, galactose, and fructose, shown here in our screen. They all have the exact same molecular formula, C6H12O6. I recommend you commit this formula to memory. It's going to be a very important formula, particularly when we get to cellular respiration. And they're isomers of each other. And when we say isomers, that means that they have the same atoms, but those same atoms are going to be arranged differently physically. And because they have the same molecular formulas but different physical structures, we can call them isomers. Now, as we look at carbohydrates, particularly these monosaccharides, if we take a complex carbohydrate or a polymer of carbohydrates, we can break it down to make these glucose, or these monosaccharides. And glucose in particular is clinically very important because that is known as blood sugar. That is the preferred fuel source within our bodies. As we think of disaccharides, di is a prefix meaning two. Saccharide is referring to sugar or carbohydrates. So we can have two subunit carbohydrates. Three significant ones are going to be sucrose, lactose, and maltose, shown here, here, and here. When we think of sucrose, I want you to think of table sugar. Lactose is typically referred to as milk sugar, and maltose is referred to as the sugar of grain byproducts. So when we think of beer, in particular, beer will have a lot of maltose within it. When we think of polysaccharides, these polysaccharides are going to be long chains of monosaccharides. So as we look at these monosaccharides that make up the polysaccharides, we can have some key and typically need to be at least 50 monomers. There's three most common polysaccharides that we need to talk about: glycogen, starch, and cellulose. So within our bodies, we as animals are going to use glycogen as our energy storage carbohydrate. So we can store energy in the form of this polysaccharide. Typically, we will store it in the liver, and from the liver we can break it down and send glucose to the rest of the body. We can also store glycogen in the muscle, brain, uterus, and vagina tissues, or vaginal tissues. But when we think of storing glycogen, I want you to primarily focus on the liver, because the liver can store it and release it back, the glucose back into the bloodstream. The glycogen that's stored in the liver will be broken into individual glucose molecules with a lot of hydrolysis reactions to turn it back into glucose that can be dumped into the bloodstream. As we look at starch, starch is the energy storage molecule for plants that we can digest. And when we think of cellulose, cellulose is a structural polysaccharide that's in plants and is not present in human cells, in that we don't make it. However, we need it because it's known as dietary fiber in human beings. It helps us to not be constipated. That's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them on our class discussion board or shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.